Before this episode begins, I want you to hear the story of one child. His name was Witold Kołodyński. He was 12 years old. On February 9th, 1943, an armed unit entered his village of Parośla in Volhynia. The following is a short reconstruction based on his recorded testimony. It is not a verbatim quotation. They came to our home pretending to be Soviet partisans. My family gave them food. After they had eaten, they told us to lie down and allowed them to bind our hands. They said it was only a precaution. They said that if the Germans came, the ropes would prove that we had been forced to help them. Then the killing began. I was struck in the head with an axe. I fell. I remained there among my murdered family, unable to move, while they believed that I was dead. And the men who had done it stayed inside our home. They ate, they drank, they celebrated. The murderers stayed in our home, feasting. Witold survived. So did his sister. Nearly the entire Polish community of Parośla was murdered. This happened months before Bloody Sunday. It was not an accident. It was not a spontaneous riot. It was a beginning. Today is July 11th. In Poland, this date is not an ordinary anniversary. It is a national day of remembrance for Polish citizens murdered by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army in the eastern territories of the pre-war Polish state. 83 years ago, on July 11th, 1943, a coordinated wave of attacks struck Polish villages, settlements, and churches across Volhynia. That day became known as Bloody Sunday. But the Volhynia massacres were not a single explosion of violence. They were not one terrible day. They were not a spontaneous riot between neighbors. They were the culmination of an organized campaign that lasted for years and spread from Volhynia into Eastern Galicia and other neighboring regions. Its objective was the removal of the Polish population. And removal did not simply mean forcing people to move. It meant terrorizing them, murdering them, burning their homes, destroying their communities, and making their return impossible. Before we continue, I need to give you a warning. This episode concerns mass violence against civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. I will not repeat the most graphic descriptions recorded by survivors. There is no need to turn human suffering into entertainment. But it is impossible to explain the nature of these crimes without speaking honestly about how they were committed. This episode is intended primarily for people outside Poland. It is also intended for Ukrainians who may have heard only one version of this history, a version in which the Ukrainian Insurgent Army is presented simply as a national liberation movement fighting Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. That description contains part of the truth. It does not contain the whole truth. And a partial truth, when it excludes the victims, can become a historical lie. Let me also make something absolutely clear from the beginning. This is not an accusation against every Ukrainian. No person alive today is guilty simply because of his or her nationality. Many Ukrainians had nothing to do with these crimes. Many opposed them. Some warned their Polish neighbors. Some hid Polish families. Some paid for that courage with their own lives. Russia is also the aggressor in the present war. Ukraine has the right to defend its independence, its territory, and its people. Acknowledging the crimes of the OUN and the UPA does not make anyone pro-Russian. Russian propaganda frequently exploits this history. But the fact that propaganda uses a historical truth does not make that truth false. We should reject Russian imperialism without accepting Ukrainian historical mythology. Both are possible. Both are necessary. So what exactly happened in Volhynia? And why is it so deeply offensive to Poles when the UPA is honored today? First, we need to understand the geography. Volhynia and Eastern Galicia were ethnically mixed regions in the eastern part of the Second Polish Republic before World War II. Today, most of that territory lies within Western Ukraine. Before the war, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Czechs, Armenians, Russians, and members of other communities lived there. Some villages were predominantly Polish, others were predominantly Ukrainian. Some were mixed. Families traded with one another, children went to school together, people worked together, attended local markets, and sometimes married across ethnic and religious lines. But this was not an idyllic world without conflict. The relationship between the Polish state and its Ukrainian minority was deeply troubled. After Poland regained independence following the First World War, millions of Ukrainians found themselves living within the borders of the Polish state. Many Ukrainians wanted national autonomy or independence. The Polish authorities often responded with distrust, forced assimilation, restrictions on Ukrainian education and institutions, and, at times, direct repression. The so-called pacification campaign of 1930 involved police and military actions against Ukrainian communities, including searches, arrests, and damage to Ukrainian organizations and property. Polish policies created real resentment. That history must not be denied. The Second Polish Republic was not always fair to its Ukrainian citizens. But context is not justification. Political discrimination does not justify murdering children. Restrictions on language or education do not justify destroying entire villages. The actions of a government do not make every civilian who shares that government's nationality a legitimate target. Most of the Poles later murdered in Volhynia were not politicians, military commanders, landowners, or senior officials. They were farmers, railway workers, craftsmen, teachers, priests, mothers, children, elderly people who had spent their entire lives in the same village. Understanding the political background helps us explain how hatred developed. It does not excuse what followed. In 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was founded. Its abbreviation was OUN. The organization sought to create an independent Ukrainian state. But it was not simply a democratic independence movement. It accepted political violence as a legitimate instrument. Its members carried out assassinations, sabotage, arson, robberies, and attacks against representatives of the Polish state, as well as against Ukrainians who supported compromise with Poland. The nation was treated as a supreme value. Individual life, legal restraint, and ordinary morality could be sacrificed if the national cause demanded it. In 1940, the OUN divided into two principal factions. One was associated with Andriy Melnik. The other, more radical faction, was led by Stepan Bandera and became known as OUN-B, the Bandera faction. It is important to be precise here. Stepan Bandera himself was held by the Germans from the summer of 1941 until the autumn of 1944. He was therefore not standing in Volhynia, personally directing every massacre. That claim would be historically inaccurate. But the organization acting in his name continued to operate. Its leaders inside occupied territory developed their own structures, policies, and armed formations. Bandera's physical absence does not erase the responsibility of OUN-B as an organization. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, emerged during the war and became closely controlled by the Bandera wing of the OUN. Its members fought the Soviet authorities. At different moments, they also fought German forces. After the return of Soviet power, the UPA continued an armed struggle against the Soviet system for years. This is the part of the story emphasized in modern Ukrainian national memory, and it is not invented. Ukrainians suffered terribly under Soviet rule. The Holodomor, political terror, deportations, executions, prison massacres, and Stalinist repression created a powerful and understandable hatred of Moscow. The desire for an independent Ukraine was legitimate. But a legitimate national aspiration does not purify every organization that claimed to represent it. A movement may fight one oppressor and still commit crimes against another people. Resistance to Stalin does not erase the murder of Polish civilians. This is also why comparing the UPA to the Polish Home Army is historically misleading. The Home Army was the military arm of the Polish underground state and answered to the internationally recognized Polish government in exile. That does not mean every Home Army soldier was innocent. Polish underground formations committed crimes, and Ukrainian civilians were killed in retaliation. Those crimes must be acknowledged. But the Home Army did not adopt a policy of removing every Ukrainian civilian from an entire region. The campaign carried out by OUN-B and the UPA in Volhynia was directed against a population identified primarily by nationality. That is the difference. You have already heard what happened in Parośla. It was not the last village. In the spring of 1943, attacks multiplied. Polish settlements were surrounded, their inhabitants gathered or surprised, and then killed. Property was taken. Buildings were burned. Survivors were forced to flee with nothing. On the night of April 23rd, the settlement of Janowa Dolina was attacked. Around 600 Polish inhabitants were killed. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. These were not isolated outbursts of anger. The same sequence appeared across a widening area: encirclement, murder, looting, fire, and pursuit of survivors. The violence reached its most concentrated point in July. Polish underground representatives attempted to negotiate with the Ukrainian nationalist leadership. One of them was Zygmunt Rumel, a poet, soldier, and emissary. He and his companions were captured and murdered. Then came Sunday, July 11th, 1943. That morning, UPA units and associated local groups attacked approximately 100 Polish settlements in several districts of Volhynia. The attacks were coordinated. Sunday was chosen because families were together and many Polish Catholics were attending Mass. In some places, people were attacked inside churches. In Poritz, armed men entered during worship. Grenades and gunfire were used against the congregation. The wounded were finished off and the church was burned. In Kiszélin, worshippers were attacked during Mass. Some barricaded themselves and resisted for hours with whatever they could find. Many others were killed. The meaning was clear. There would be no sanctuary. Not in a home, not in a village, not even in a church. The methods of killing remain one of the most painful parts of this history. Firearms were used, but often the weapons were axes, knives, pitchforks, scythes, clubs, hammers, and other farming or household tools. There were practical reasons. Ammunition was limited, and locally recruited participants brought what they had. But terror was also part of the strategy. The cruelty was meant to spread fear beyond the place where the killing occurred. One destroyed village warned the next 10 villages what would happen if they stayed. This is why the description, a conflict between Poles and Ukrainians, is not enough. Yes, there was a wider Polish-Ukrainian conflict. Yes, there were armed clashes. Yes, both communities suffered. But on Bloody Sunday and throughout the anti-Polish campaign in Volhynia, the primary targets were civilians, women, children, the elderly, people whose only crime was that they were Polish and lived on land claimed for a future Ukrainian state. The campaign did not end in July. It continued through the rest of 1943 and spread more widely into Eastern Galicia in 1944. Some Polish communities organized self-defense, while others fled to towns, forests, railway stations, or military posts. But many villages had no real protection. By the time help arrived, there was often no village left to defend. How many people were killed? No final number can be established with complete certainty. Records were destroyed. Entire communities disappeared. Many victims were never identified, and many bodies remain in unmarked graves. A widely cited estimate is around 100,000 Polish victims. Roughly 40 to 60,000 were murdered in Volhynia. Between 20 and 40,000 were killed in Eastern Galicia. Several thousand more died in neighboring regions. Some historians propose lower totals. Others propose higher ones. The exact number remains a subject of research. But uncertainty about the final number does not create uncertainty about the nature of the campaign. Even the most cautious estimates describe tens of thousands of civilians killed because they were Polish. This was not a battle in which two armies suffered comparable losses. It was an organized attempt to destroy the Polish presence in a large territory. Were Ukrainian civilians killed by Poles? Yes. As news of the massacre spread, Polish self-defense units and underground formations carried out retaliatory and preventive actions. Some attacks were directed against UPA units. Others struck Ukrainian villages. In several cases, Polish forces murdered civilians, including women and children. Those crimes cannot be excused simply because they were called retaliation. The victims were innocent, and they deserve remembrance. Estimates commonly cited for Ukrainians killed in Polish actions reach approximately 10 to 12,000. But acknowledging those crimes does not mean creating a false symmetry. the anti-Polish campaign came first. It was organized around the removal of a civilian national population. It was far larger in scale, and there was no equivalent central policy of the Polish underground state ordering the destruction of every Ukrainian community across an entire region. Saying that both sides committed crimes is true. Saying that both sides carried out the same campaign is false. There is another truth that must not be lost. Some Ukrainians saved Poles. They warned neighbors before planned attacks. They hid children. They brought food to families escaping through forests. They gave false directions to armed groups. They helped wounded people cross roads or rivers. Some paid with their lives. Polish researchers have documented more than 1,000 Ukrainians who provided assistance, and the real number was probably higher. Their courage matters. It proves that hatred was not inevitable. They faced the same fear as those around them, yet chose to see a neighbor rather than an ethnic enemy. Remembering them does not weaken the truth about the massacre. It makes that truth complete. This was not the Ukrainian nation acting as one body. It was a campaign organized by nationalist structures, carried out by armed formations, and supported in many places by local participants. Other Ukrainians refused. Some resisted. Some rescued. That distinction is morally necessary. And now we come to the present. For years, the Ukrainian state has increasingly presented the OUN and the UPA primarily as fighters for independence. That memory became especially powerful after Russia renewed its war against Ukraine. The logic is easy to understand. A nation fighting Moscow naturally looks back for symbols of earlier resistance. But that does not make every symbol acceptable. A state cannot select only the heroic part of an organization's record and erase the civilians who were murdered under its banner. The UPA fought Soviet rule. It also carried out ethnic cleansing against Poles. Both statements are true. A mature historical memory must be able to hold both at once. In May of 2026, President Volodymyr Zelensky approved the honorary name Heroes of the UPA for a Ukrainian Special Forces unit. Ukrainian officials argued that the name honored resistance to Moscow and was not intended as an insult to Poland. But intention does not erase meaning. For Polish families, the letters UPA do not mean only anti-Soviet resistance. They mean Parośla, Janowa Dolina, Poryc, Kisielin, Ostrówki, Wola Ostrowiecka, and thousands of people who never received a proper grave. You cannot honor an organization for the chapter you admire while ordering its victims to forget the chapter written in their blood. No modern Ukrainian is personally responsible for crimes committed before birth. The issue is the responsibility of a state when it chooses public symbols. A government chooses whom it places in the national pantheon, and those choices have consequences. The most basic demand is not revenge. Poland is not asking Ukrainian families to pay compensation for crimes committed before they were born. The demand is truth. Full access for searches and exhumations, the burial of victims, clear condemnation of mass murder, and an end to glorification that hides the anti-Polish campaign behind the language of liberation. A grave is not Russian propaganda. An exhumation is not an attack on Ukrainian sovereignty. A cross over murdered civilians does not weaken the Ukrainian army. Some people say that raising this subject helps Russia. Russia certainly exploits every conflict between Poland and Ukraine, but historical denial gives Russian propaganda more power, not less. The answer to manipulation is not silence, it is documented truth. Ukraine could weaken Russian propaganda by saying clearly, the struggle for Ukrainian independence was legitimate, Soviet oppression was real, and members and structures of OUN-B and the UPA committed mass crimes against Polish civilians. We honor the desire for freedom. We condemn ethnic cleansing. We allow the dead to be found and buried. That statement would not humiliate Ukraine. It would strengthen it. Democratic nations do not become weaker when they confront crimes committed in their name. They become more credible. And yes, this will matter on Ukraine's path toward the European Union. European integration is also about trust between neighbors. Polish support cannot be treated as automatic, while the Ukrainian state honors the UPA without clearly confronting what it did to Polish civilians. This is not an attempt to stop Ukraine from existing. It is a demand that reconciliation be built on truth, rather than selective memory. To Ukrainian listeners, I want to say this plainly. You are not being asked to hate your country. You are not being asked to accept Soviet or Russian propaganda. You are not being asked to abandon the history of Ukrainian resistance. You are being asked to own the whole history. To separate the legitimate goal of independence from the murder of civilians. To understand why the name UPA causes pain in Poland. And to recognize that no nation has the right to build pride by silencing another nation's dead. To Polish listeners, I would say something equally important. Do not use Volhynia as permission to hate Ukrainians living among us today. Do not treat a Ukrainian child, refugee, worker, student, or neighbor as personally guilty for events that happened more than 80 years ago. The victims were murdered because human beings were reduced to national categories. We must not repeat that moral failure. But rejecting collective hatred does not require collective amnesia. We can oppose Russian imperialism. We can support Ukraine's right to survive. We can acknowledge Polish crimes against Ukrainian civilians. And we can still state the central truth. OUN-B and the UPA carried out an organized campaign of ethnic cleansing against Polish civilians in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. On July 11th, we remember people who went to church and never returned home. We remember villages that disappeared. Parents who could not save their children. Children who survived without parents. People buried in forests, fields, wells, and nameless pits. We remember those whose names are known and those whose names may never be recovered. We also remember the Ukrainians who warned their Polish neighbors, those who opened the door, those who hid a child, those who refused to join, those who chose humanity when cruelty had become acceptable. The victims do not ask us for revenge. They ask for memory, graves, and truth. And they ask us not to call their killers heroes. May the victims of Volhynia and Eastern Galicia rest in peace. And just as I was finishing this episode, another piece of news arrived. A commission of the Lviv Regional Council has supported a proposal to declare 2027 the year of Roman Shukevich, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and Oleg Olzhich. The proposal has not yet been finally adopted by the full council, but the direction itself is deeply disturbing. After the decision to place the name Heroes of the UPA on a modern Ukrainian military unit, after the Order of the White Eagle was returned to Poland by courier, Ukrainian political elites are apparently considering yet another public celebration of the same historical tradition. As a Pole, I have to ask, what exactly are you trying to achieve? How far do you intend to push this? You cannot defend the honor of your own nation by trampling on the memory of another nation's murdered civilians. You cannot demand solidarity, understanding, and European support while treating the victims of Volhynia as an inconvenience standing in the way of your national mythology. If President Zelensky, his government, and Ukraine's political elites genuinely want their country to join the European Union, they need to think very carefully about the path they are choosing. Poland will not be expected to support European Union membership for a state that publicly glorifies formations and commanders inseparable from the ethnic cleansing of Polish civilians. This is not hostility toward Ukraine. It is not support for Russia. It is a boundary. So please, stop. Look honestly at what you are doing. National dignity cannot be built on the graves of another nation's victims. European reconciliation requires truth, responsibility, and respect. Without them, there can be no trust. And without trust, there can be no shared European future.